El Salvador, still by far the most dangerous country in the world in the year 2015. In this country of just 6 million inhabitants, there were over 100 homicides per 100,000 inhabitants. In comparison, the figure for Germany was 0.25. The small Central American country was home to the most notorious gangs in the world, including MS-13 and Barrio 18, and the government had no control over most of the country. El Salvador was considered a failed state. But today, just a few years later, the situation has turned 100 degrees. The murder rate is now only 0.4 homicides per day, the government has regained complete control and even tourists are returning to the country. The Salvadoran president now describes his country as the safest in the whole of Latin America. And other Latin American countries are now copying El Salvador's policy. So what is this drastic change all about? How has El Salvador managed to curb crime, and what dark secret lies behind El Salvador's system? We take a look at all these exciting questions in today's video. First of all, we need to look at how El Salvador became the most dangerous country in the world in the first place. In the 1980s and early 1990s, the country was initially in the midst of a protracted civil war. The war arose from a deep-rooted conflict between a repressive government dominated by an elite and left-wing guerrilla groups demanding social and economic reforms. This conflict was characterized by extreme violence and brutality. Both sides were responsible for human rights violations and massacres. There were numerous casualties among the civilian population, causing deep social and political divisions to develop in the country. The war led to massive destruction, economic stagnation, and the loss of tens of thousands of lives. Many Salvadorans were forced to leave the country, resulting in a large diaspora, especially in the United States. After years of intense negotiations, a peace agreement was signed in the year 1992, mediated by the United Nations. This agreement ended the civil war and was intended to lay the foundations for democracy and reconstruction in El Salvador. So everything seemed to be getting better. Not really, because the war left behind a deeply divided country with weak state institutions, widespread poverty, and a traumatized population. It also claimed over 75,000 victims, and many Salvadorans were displaced or fled abroad. What remained were many orphaned or abandoned young people. And this, combined with a lack of education and very limited economic opportunities, created an environment in which crime and gang membership often appeared to be the only way out for young people. The notorious gangs were founded in the USA by Salvadoran immigrants. The two most notorious gangs, MS-13 and Barrio 18, emerged in the 1980s and would later fight each other again and again. Many of these gang members were deported from the USA in the 1990s or returned home voluntarily after the end of the Civil War. And so they continued their criminal activities in El Salvador and expanded. The gangs quickly built up a network in their home country, recruited local young people, and established themselves in communities, often using brutal violence. They had an easy hand in this, as the new Salvadoran government was often uncoordinated and ineffective against the well-organized gangs. It was also involved in numerous scandals and corruption, as well as a weak justice system, contributed to many crimes going unpunished, which further undermined the population's trust in state institutions. As a result, tens of thousands of people, especially young people, joined the criminal networks in the hope of a better life. Moreover, thanks to their good contacts in the USA, the gangs quickly turned El Salvador into one of the main hubs for drug trafficking. And so the situation continued to deteriorate in the 2000s. Due to gang warfare, drug trafficking, and organized crime, the country became the most dangerous country in the world, with murder rates of up to 100 a day. There seemed to be no way out for the country until everything changed abruptly in 2019. The population was tired of believing the eternal lies and promises to improve the situation of the established parties, and so a political upheaval emerged in the elections. The long-standing dominance of the two major parties, the right-wing Arena and the left-wing FMLN, was broken, and a young and charismatic politician won the presidential elections as a candidate outside the traditional political parties. It was Nayib Bukele. He ran on the promise of fighting corruption, revitalizing the economy, and ending the pervasive violence and gang crime once and for all. And looking back, we can say that this time it really wasn't just empty promises, but that he did everything he could to end the violence, regardless of the consequences. He immediately declared a nationwide state of emergency, which made it easier for the authorities to arrest criminals and suspects. Within 10 months, almost 63,000 people were arrested, and to date the figure is well over 100,000. That is an incredible number for a population of just 6.5 million people. This means that almost 2% of the entire population is in prison, making it the country with the highest number of prisoners per capita in the world. It was only in January that Bukele inaugurated a new mega prison in the southwest of the country, which will have space for 40,000 more inmates. The government is continuing its course. All people who have anything remotely to do with the gangs are arrested immediately. As a result, everyday life returned to the streets of the country for the first time, crime fell drastically, and Bukele also reorganized the country in other respects. He focused on strengthening the economy, including the promotion of foreign investment and the development of tourism and infrastructure. And he did so quite successfully. He endeavored to reposition El Salvador on the international stage by forging new relationships, particularly with the USA, and presenting the country as a progressive and innovative state. One of these measures was the introduction of Bitcoin as an official means of payment. His authoritarian approach also enabled him to contain the pandemic fairly quickly, and he has established numerous initiatives to improve the country's education and healthcare system in recent years. However, this success has come at a high price. Arbitrary arrests, cruel police violence, and inhumane detention conditions are the order of the day. The state of emergency allows the police to temporarily detain people for 15 days. During this time, many detainees do not know the reasons for their arrest and cannot count on the presumption of innocence or a fair trial. As a result, many innocent people are held in the country's brutal prisons. The prisons are hopelessly overcrowded, and the prison conditions have been reduced to the bare minimum for survival. There are no mattresses or blankets, and the prisoners have absolutely nothing. Nor is there any prospect of release. The government is talking about never letting these so-called terrorists back onto the streets. Foreign governments and human rights organizations are therefore repeatedly appalled and speak of inhumane conditions. And the police are now not only targeting gang members, but also government critics. Which brings us to another point of criticism of Bukele's style of government. He is accused of taking an increasingly authoritarian approach and wanting to establish autocratic rule. One striking example was when he used the military to put pressure on parliament to approve a financing law. Accusations of restrictions on press freedom and the arbitrary application of the law during the state of emergency have also been raised time and again. It is also difficult to independently verify the incredible drop from over 100 to just 0.4 homicides per day. However, the majority of the population seems to be extremely satisfied with their new president and thanks him with approval ratings of an incredible 90%. And so a re-election next year also seems extremely likely. After all, his system has been highly successful in curbing gang crime. In just a few years, what was once the most dangerous country in the world has become a role model for the entire region. Neighboring countries such as Honduras and Guatemala are now copying Bukele's system. The left is copying the model 1-to-1, and in the presidential elections in Guatemala this summer, all candidates ran on the promise of curbing violence along the lines of El Salvador. And even in countries such as Colombia and Chile, Bukele has large followings who see his strategy as the most effective way to end violence and crime.